Great. So welcome to Night School. I'm Jeremy, he, him, a member of the North Brooklyn Political Education Committee and also the North Brooklyn representative to our New York City DSA Steering Committee. I'm so pleased to welcome everybody to our winter night school. What better thing is there to do than learn during these still pandemic exciting months where we're all holed up in the cold. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, we at Night School always emphasize that a lot of kind of what we're up to here, what we're trying to do is we try to, we as socialists are trying to clarify our values, what we stand for, why we stand for it. We are thinking through our strategy, developing an analysis to understand why the world is not the same as we wish it were and how we can change that. And then orienting ourselves towards action, towards changing the world. So that's what we're up to. And this semester of the night school kind of does a deep dive into a lot of our programmatic campaigns, including Medicare for All, Green New Deal, immigration and open borders, ending mass incarceration, and many other important topics for socialists, and very strategy focused semester of the night school, taxing the rich, etc. For this, to open it though, we wanted to, again, do kind of another thing we do in night school, sort of get a big picture, think more generally about how we're orienting ourselves politically in the present moment. And I couldn't think of a better person than Thomas Frank to invite to help us do that. And he, said yes for some reason, I'm not sure why. I just, so I'll just say a couple words of introduction and then start a conversation with Tom. We'll talk for a little bit. Some people on the Poly Ed committee will kind of come in, and then I think about 7:30 we'll then just open up the stack and have a wider conversation with all of us, because I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about. So by way of introduction, if people need an introduction, Thomas Frank, in my opinion, is America's best living political essayist. For some of us who were old enough to be coming to political awareness in the late 90s, early 2000s, The Baffler and his books were just like precious oxygen in a terrible time. One can name many of them, including some of the ones we know very well, like What's the Matter with Kansas, and some of the ones that, Pity the Billionaire or Commodify Your Dissent, or others that also were just life's blood. And then Thomas Frank has been, once again, I think, at the kind of cutting edge of understanding what's going on in the present, in the transformation of American politics in the last 4 years, with both the Bernie Sanders campaign and Trump's victory. His books, Listen Liberal, and the new book, The People Know, which he'll be talking a fair bit about today, are just like absolutely fundamental reading for leftists getting oriented around how the right works its magic, why the Democrats have sucked for a long time, and how we can think about changing the situation. So again, Tom, thank you so much. Welcome to our political education group.
It's my pleasure. And let me just say that I'm happy to talk about any of the things that you mentioned. And Jeremy, that was a very nice introduction, and I don't deserve that kind of that kind of loyalty and that sort of thing. But I'll talk about anything you guys want. But it'd be best to start with populism and the current book. And I'm happy to talk about any of the past, going all the way back to the 90s, or hell, even the 80s, if you want.
Well, so on the populism, I mean, I recall you saying somewhere that this book started out that you wanted to write a history of populism, but you ended up writing a history of anti-populism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'll tell you the whole story. So I went to graduate school. I'm sure a lot of you did as well. This was back in the 80s, and I studied history. and my idea was to be a historian. And I came out. I don't want to get off the subject here, but this is something that has it was very formative to me. I got my PhD in the middle of, well, it was actually the beginning of the academic job crisis, but we didn't think it was. We thought this was a new and disturbing thing, and it's still going on today. It's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And so I wound up, instead of going into academia, I wound up doing what I do now. And but the subject that I studied when I first went to graduate school was populism, which is a word that means something very particular in America. And it was a word that meant a lot to me, especially because I was from Kansas. I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City, which are the ones that are in Kansas. If anybody here is from Kansas City, Johnson County, Kansas is where I grew up. And populism was something that was very important to people from Kansas once upon a time. It was a sort of a political movement that more or less flowered in Kansas in the 1890s. And I studied, like I said, I studied it in graduate school. I gave up on it, went on to do other things. But a couple of years ago, when I noticed how the word populism was being so massively abused, I've just in the last few days here, I've seen it used many times to describe this mob that attacked the Capitol building. That's supposedly, that's populism, right? And people have been using the word to mean things like that, basically to mean racist demagogue or a mob rule, these sort of horrible things. They've been using it that way for 5 or 6 years now in America. That's become the sort of hegemonic definition. Whereas 20 years ago, people would use it to describe someone like Bernie Sanders. Barack Obama even used it at one point to describe himself. Kind of an interesting move there, but that was, back in the early, 10 years ago anyways. So I decided to write this book about what populism actually meant, the true history of the original populist movement and its legacy over the years. So, there's this populist tradition in America, and I thought that was important to write about. The reason I thought it was important was because we're all on the left here, and it's an extremely frustrating thing to do, to spend your life, sort of pursuing in this country, pursuing this kind of left-wing politics. And I want to point out to people that it hasn't always been that way, that the left hasn't always been marginalized in this country. I mean, it's always been a tough fight, but there have been moments in our national history where people who agree with us were in charge, had a party, had a movement, had success after success. And the sort of thing that we were, the sort of things that we believe in once upon a time were extremely popular in this country. They were so extremely popular that it terrified the sort of powers that be in this country. And they made the name of the populist movement into a curse word. Which we'll talk about later. So anyhow, I wrote that sort of the happy history, the history of populism, of the populist tradition and its successes, and where it went in American life and the things that you can claim as populist. So the movement in the 1890s, the great events of the 1930s, both culturally and politically, the rise of the labor movement, et cetera. And also to a certain degree, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which was often compared to, we aren't going to get one of those Zoom bombers, are we?
I think we're okay.
I was on a call a while ago with a bunch of academics, and it happened. And that's exactly how it started. They started reflecting somebody's words back at them. And then the next thing you know, they were showing pornography or something like this. It was absolutely nuts. Anyhow, so I'm writing this story of different populist moments in American life. And what starts to leap out at me are the people who hate populism. who hated it in the 1890s, and then who are very similar to the people who hated the New Deal in the 1930s, in fact, used almost exactly the same arguments. And then you see the exact same stuff nowadays in our own time. And so there's also this anti-populist tradition in American life that is profoundly mistrustful, not only of mass movements of working class people, but of democracy itself. And by the way, you open any newspaper in America, and you'll see this stuff in they are in high voice right now, saying that this is what happens when you allow democracy. You know, this is why the ancient Greeks, referring to the events at the Capitol, this is why the ancient Greeks didn't trust democracy. This is why they learned that democracy, couldn't, and all these people saying we have an excess of democracy in this country. People think they can blow off the elites. By the way, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Jeremy,
you were
okay?
In and out for a second, but now it's fine.
Okay. I think if I hold still and stop like moving and gesticulating. But so there's this anti-populist tradition that is for, obviously most of its history was a tradition of the right, of the extreme right. And I'll talk about this in detail if you want. It's very amusing. And these people denounced the original populist movement in the most outrageous terms. Called it anarchy, called it mob rule, called it, they thought it was the French Revolution. And they denounced the New Deal in exactly the same way. And what's fascinating to me today is that this anti-populist tradition that so strongly mistrusts ordinary people is today, it's been embraced by liberalism. We're in a very freaky time where everything is turning upside down very slowly but surely in our politics. And this tradition of mistrusting the people, denouncing mass movements of working class people. God, I was just reading a book the other day by John Meacham. And this is a guy that's advising Biden and that writes Biden's speeches for him. And he says that mass movements are the problem in American history. Mass movements are where we go wrong. Mass movements are what, this is what ails us. But this is okay. And after this, we'll go into questions. I'm here to tell you that it's the exact opposite is the case. That it's mass movements that are, giving us the only progress we've ever had in this country. The mass movements in the 1890s, in the 30s, and in the 1960s. And it's rule by experts, rule by the professional class, which is for some progressives, this is the dream, right? This is what they always want. That's what always winds up, giving you nothing. That's like the Obama administration. That's like the Vietnam War. That's every disaster.
But you were pretty optimistic about Obama. I remember, right?
Once upon a time, yeah, when he was young and fresh. There's a reason for that. I had met him. He was my. I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school, and he was my state senator. And I had met him and was very impressed by him. Everybody in Hyde Park. This is where the University of Chicago is located. This is the neighborhood where it is.
I'm also a University of Chicago grad, so we can have a Hyde Park moment too.
He was very. Everybody had met him. He was a figure of destiny. Everybody could see this, and I am almost ashamed to say it, but I thought after 8 years of George W. Bush and the hacks and the cronies and the idiots running everything, that what we really needed was some competence in the federal government. And we got that. Hell, you look at his cabinet, right, that he brought in 2009, glittering with prizes and endowed chairs. He even had the president of Harvard University, advising him on economic policy. And they continued the Bush administration, policy towards the banks, basically unchanged. And this led me to ask all sorts of questions about what I really believed in and why this had gone so wrong. Because for me, the Obama years were a great disappointment. And that's what led to everything that I'm describing now. We'll talk about that in more detail as we go on. All right. Let me have it, Jeremy.
I mean, I guess the next, for me, logical question is why is contemporary liberalism proved so open to this idea of rule by the elites when, as you point out, like the Democratic Party, I mean, has a long history, somewhat parts of it rather dubious, but certainly like kind of its most popular period, its legislative victories all come in the New Deal period, its most populist moment. So why would it be that the Democrats, how does that happen where the Democrats become the party of elites, management, experts, et cetera?
Well, okay, that's a huge question. We could talk about this all night. But long story short, there's two basic answers. One is the kind of intellectual answer, and the other is the demographic answer. And the intellectual answer, historians argue about this all the time. What allowed for the great success of the New Deal? And a lot of historians will tell you, well, it's because they finally put intellectuals in charge of everything. And I don't buy that. I mean, yes, they did put intellectuals in charge of some things, but if you go back and look at who the intellectuals were, it was not like Obama's cabinet. It was not the best and the brightest. It was not the president or the president of Harvard University. It was it tended to be people from really unusual places, from out of the way places, in really peculiar walks of life. And I could, give you all the different examples of this, but you guys can probably, them as well as I do. Harry Hopkins, his right-hand man, Roosevelt's right-hand man who ran the WPA, this organizational genius, was a social worker from Iowa. Harry Truman never went to college. Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, ran a magazine for farmers. None of these guys were not, I mean, Henry Wallace was a brilliant man, but he was not like some champion of orthodoxy. He was not a celebrated, an endowed chair at an Ivy League university. Roosevelt did not bring in that kind of person. He brought in people with unusual ideas from unusual places. The guy that ran the Federal Reserve, who sort of invented Keynesianism, had never read Keynes. He was a small town banker from Utah. It's just, the stories are incredible. One of his big economic advisors was this guy, John Kenneth Galbraith, who spent his entire career denouncing what he called conventional wisdom. So yes, Roosevelt had intellectual advisors, but Roosevelt didn't trust intellectuals, and he didn't appoint the best and the brightest. That remained that's something more recent. You look at there's a great book, by the way, to take a swerve into a really sad chapter of our history. There's a great book that came out in the early 70s called The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. And it was one of the first efforts to understand the Vietnam War, to historicize the Vietnam War. Why did this happen? How did we get into this terrible disaster? And the title basically gives the whole argument away. The Vietnam War was basically a project of the political science departments of America, and that's how he describes it. This is, all of these chairmen of these departments get together advising President Kennedy and then President Johnson. You have people like Robert McNamara, who was the great managerial genius of that period, who basically devised the Vietnam War. You had all these political scientists from Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. That's who ran it. That's who dreamed it up. That's whose baby it was. Okay, that's the theoretical side of it. And it's incredibly simple. They just say the same thing that that it's a very natural mistake. They say, well, you want the smartest people in America running things, right? They're the smartest. They'll do the best job. I thought that too once. And what I realized is that when you do this, these people persistently fail, and they persistently fail in a very particular way, that they refuse to do the kind of things that you and I want them to do. Well, why is that? And what I discovered is that they act as a class, that they are not just geniuses floating above it all, giving us the best possible answer to things. They're also members of a social cohort like anybody else. And they identify with this social cohort, and they have a very strong sense of class identification. And they do things that are, they do incredible favors for other members of that cohort. For example, the Obama crew bailing out Wall Street, and even more important, refusing to prosecute Wall Street for obvious financial fraud. When they were prosecuting, you know, all sorts of homeowners who lied on mortgage applications, but they wouldn't prosecute other people like themselves, other Ivy League graduates, other people with advanced degrees, people they knew personally and, you know, believed to be good people. You know, as the famous saying from the Obama years, I forget which person in the Justice Department said this, but he's like, look, they just made one little mistake. You can't ruin a guy's life for that. Okay, now the demographic reason, which is also really interesting. When I was young, the Democratic Party was very closely identified with organized labor. This was everybody knew this. This was not like something that today when I talk to audiences of young people, you have to explain this to them. You know, they don't know it, right? That the Democratic Party was once identified with labor unions. And what happened is that all through the 1970s, the Democratic Party, in the 80s and the 90s, slowly but surely moved away from organized labor and reaching out for these new demographic groups. And the group that they particularly were, you know, lusting for, they were really keen on pursuing, was the professional elite, professional class. And they, you know, this is what Listen Liberal is about, you know, the Democratic Party making this trading labor and essentially trading blue collar voters for collar voters. And this is actually not something that you have to read between the lines to figure out. You don't have to, like, you know, it's not like a mystery. They said this. They were very open about it. They're open about it to this day. They're, you know, they think this was the right thing to do. There was a group within the Democratic. Yeah, but I was thinking of Hillary Clinton, her famous remarks after the 2016 election, where she said, okay, so I lost the election, but I won the areas that produced 2/3 of the American GDP. You know, they talk about this all the time. And this is, they've actually been successful in this. Oh, wait, I skipped a step. There was a group within the Democratic Party. If you're my age, you remember them. They were called the Democratic Leadership Council. This is the group that Bill Clinton came out of. Their open profession of purpose was to shift the Democratic Party to the right, to basically embrace the Reagan agenda, you know, within the Democratic Party. And they, you know, it's easy to look up what they stood for and what they said. They had a magazine. They had actually more than one magazine. They wrote books. You know, they were intellectuals. And they said this all the time, that we have to embrace this cohort. They came up with names for them. They would call them the learning class, the people who are going to be the winners in the information age. They called them the wired workers. They would talk about the creative class. Remember Richard Florida's book about these people? And their argument was that this is the future of the Democratic Party. This is who we have to reach out to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they did it. And look, folks, they've been very successful at this pursuit. I mentioned earlier that I come from Johnson County, Kansas. It's the affluent, like white flight suburbs of Kansas City. And if you go back and look at my book, What's the Matter with Kansas, I describe the area in great detail. These very, very affluent Republicans that I grew up among. I was not one of them. We were not rich people, but I was surrounded by not just rich people. These are some of the richest people in America. And they were Republicans, and they were the ruling class of the city. I mean, they owned everything. They were the ruling class of the state. And of course, they were Republicans. They were the most Republican people in the world. They hadn't voted for a Democrat for president since Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And Biden just took it. Biden just won Johnson County, Kansas. First time the Democrats have won it since 1916. So, and these are white collar people. And I went back, I looked at the precinct by precinct information, and he won my neighborhood that I grew up in. All of these very, very wealthy people. He won every single precinct in that richest corner of the state of Kansas, richest corner of Kansas City. And what I'm saying is this strategy has succeeded. This outreach of the Democrats to the white collar voters, to the sort of winners in the information age, you know, to Wall Street, Silicon Valley, et cetera. This has succeeded. You know, if you want to think about it, but it's at what cost? And that's that's where Trumpism comes in, and all the sort of awful story of our time. At what cost? You know, when you have a party of the left, wait a minute. You asked me a really simple question, Jeremy. Just listen to me go on.
No, I want to hear this because, yeah.
I just talked too goddamn much. But I'll make one last point. And the reason I'm going to make this point is because you guys are in DSA and you'll appreciate this. And this is my sort of my what do you call it? My overarching subject that I write about in every book. And that it's this: what does a middle class society like ours, like the one I grew up in, I mean, it's come apart, right? But what is a society like that? What does a society like that look like when it no longer has a real left? When the party of the left, which is what the Democrats are in our stupid system, when they decide they don't want to be a party of the left anymore, they want to be something different. They don't want to be a traditional left party. They want to be something else. What happens to a society when you make a change like that? Well, one thing is obvious: inequality. The social fabric just coming apart. And another thing is Trumpism. And these are the two great consequences. And then there's many others, like just the shitty health system that we have. We could go on and on about the particulars, but those are the two things. And I think about that all the time.
That's like a wonderful formulation. I was wondering how is it that Trumpism emerges from this? Because I get the sense that, there's something in this book and in your work on populism generally where you're in part defending the honor of an actual historical movement called populism, and you're trying to understand something like there being sort of a populist space in politics, and it basically either the left is going to occupy it or the right is, but sort of someone is.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I always call it a market niche. I used to study marketing long ago, but there is a left, there's a market niche for populism, or for the traditional left, or for working class movements, or however you want to describe it. And that will never go away. There's a need. Those people exist. Their lives suck, for a million reasons. We all know what those reasons are. And those people are not going away, are not going anywhere. And if the Democratic Party says, well, we're not interested, for whatever reason, says we're not interested in you anymore, we're interested in this beautiful globalized information economy, and the winners in that, whatever their reason is, those people are still there. And the other party in the system, the Republican Party, is going to find some way to reach out to those people. I want to remind you, before we go on, of one of the mottos of Clintonism. If those of you who were too young in the 90s to remember this, they used to say, I don't know if Bill Clinton himself ever said this, but Democrats would say this all the time, referring to Black voters, referring to union voters, referring to a bunch of different groups. They'd say, well, those people have nowhere else to go, because the Republican Party was so far to the right. So they just said, well, these are captured constituents. We don't have to do anything for them. They're not going to vote for the Republicans, and we can count on them coming out and giving us their vote every couple of years, and we don't have to deliver anything to them. And we can go on this great quest for these new constituent groups and these new ideologies and this new politics, they've got nowhere else to go. And what that logic ignores is that the Republican Party is not just going to sit still and not notice that you're doing this. These guys are good at the game. They're extremely good at the game, and they're dynamic, and they are going to find a way. And that way is the culture wars, or that way is the sort of racial antagonism, or whatever, fill in the blank with whatever you want. They are going to find some way of reaching out to these people that the party of the left takes for granted. And Trump as good as said this. You remember his famous, in 2016, his famous appeal to Black voters. What do you got to lose? Make it change. What have you got to lose? Or whatever it was. But he was basically reaching out to all of these groups that feel taken for granted by the Democratic Party. And by the way, feel that correctly, because they are taken for granted by the Democratic Party. And that's not just Trump. This goes back to Reagan. This goes back to Nixon. The Republicans have been very, very good at playing this game, at filling that populist space. Now, they don't do it by delivering populist things. They don't do it by actually following through and do it like that's what DSA wants to do. They don't do that. They do these other things, these awful things, like let's have a culture war. Let's get mad at Hollywood. Let's moan about the war on Christmas. On and on, and let's storm the Capitol. On and on and on with this bullshit, that never ends. But this is, and I will shut up here, I promise. This was this is what What's the Matter with Kansas was all about. It's about the way Republicans reach out to these people who have been left behind by the Democratic Party. Okay.
The party, the left behind, or sort of the losers in the society, not the winners in the great struggle of life or in the great meritocracy. I guess a couple other things I had in mind, and then maybe we can open it up. One was just maybe if you can give like a brief definition of sort of how you see populism, what you see are its like virtues as a political a way of thinking about politics, a way of doing politics, and why in the book you often make this claim that there's something kind of particularly American about populism, that I think you say something like populism is left-wing politics in the American strain, or something of that nature. So I'd be curious about that. And then, let's do that one. And then I have one more.
Yeah. So this is another thing that another hobby horse that historians like to write about, because populism was the movement in the 1890s that spelled it with a capital P. These are, by the way, the guys who invented the word. They made up the word populism. It's not like a word from, I was reading some commentator just this morning saying that this is why the ancient Greeks hated and feared populism. And it's like 3 Pinocchios for this guy. The word populism was invented in 1891. The ancient Greeks never heard this word, and it was invented by dudes in my home state riding on a train in Kansas. They were trying to come up with a name for their party. And this party got going, and like I said, in the early 1890s. It was a farmer labor party. It was proudly about the working class. They said we are a class-based party. We're all about the working class. They were very adamant about this. They wouldn't even let like lawyers be members at first. They changed that later, but it took off. Okay, so there's two things. It happens at the same time as the Labour Party in the UK, Labour Party in Australia, a little bit after like the Social Democrats in Germany. But it's all of these different left parties in the Western countries are being founded at about the same time. And second of all, it takes off. Populism immediately catches fire and sweeps a bunch of states on the Great Plains and also in the South, and is eventually it comes a cropper. It gets defeated. The two major parties basically come together against it and destroy it in all of these different places. It's a long story. It's actually a very amusing story how it gets defeated. But the populist impulse and the populist language come back again and again and again in American life. This kind of working class producerist language. And what historians argue about, now the socialist tradition in America has never caught on in that way. You've had various efforts to launch socialist parties, but it's never had the kind of success that populism did, or that the left wing, like a Franklin Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, did. Although there's lots of overlap. For example, Eugene Debs was a populist at one point. And then when populism died, went over to the Socialist Party, and as did many of the leaders of the populist movement. And in fact, in early books about the Socialist Party in America often remark on the populist legacy. They would have the socialists would have these big camp meetings out on the prairie, and they were very popular in Oklahoma, stuff like that. Yeah. And but basically,
Dubuque, Iowa. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, basically, socialism has had all sorts of people who use the word socialism. Populism had all kinds of socialist elements to it. For example, they wanted to nationalize the railroads. They wanted to nationalize the telegraph system. And then a lot of elements that we think of as more New Deal type. They wanted a massive federal program for farmers. They wanted deficit spending. And then a lot of reform stuff, like they wanted votes for women, that sort of thing. They wanted to crack down on lobbying. And but they had there were a lot of obviously socialist elements to it, but it wasn't based on Marx. It's based on Jefferson. And they draw their lineage, straight back to Thomas Jefferson. And they speak in a very American vernacular. Now they knew who Marx was. He does come up in their writing from time to time, but they weren't like what we think of as Marxists. So that's the important point there. And historians always argue back and forth about whether it's compatible with socialism. And I just think that's a silly argument, especially to be having in this day and age when the left is just flat on its back, and we don't really need, to have silly, oh, come on, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Doctrinal or
sectarian arguments, like are farmers a radical class or are they not? Like, who the hell cares? Anybody. So I'll sign up anybody. I don't give a damn.
Yeah, and I think, on that, and certainly I think, one of the things about Bernie Sanders that was so extraordinary was like this kind of very American kind of socialism that on the one was also kind of more advanced than European social democracy in a lot of ways, certainly more of like had more fight in it, a hell of a lot more fight than the German socialists had.
This is one of the reasons I wrote the book, or that I wrote Listen Liberal, I should say. I met with a German SDP politician, and he was he was saying to me, like, we don't even know why we exist anymore. We're no different than the other parties. There's no, we don't have anything we don't stand for anything. And they're exactly like the American Democratic Party. I know Bernie Sanders is a great hero because he understands the situation. And I used to say, if only Bernie wouldn't call himself a socialist. But then again, what is he supposed to call himself? He in my opinion, he's more in the populist tradition. He talks like a populist, he has that kind of Old Testament, that great, prophet in the wilderness kind of way of looking at things. But he's, the word populism has been poisoned too. So in fact, if anything, it's more poisonous than socialism now, thanks to Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, these guys. So he can't call himself that. So, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, we're here at the Democratic Socialists of America, so.
Yeah, no, I know. Oh, yeah.
And I guess like on the Bernie side of things, this is my last question. Like, how do you, what are sort of, so clearly there has been a new left at the same time as this, as you refer to it, like a pseudo-populist or a fake populist right has like grown and has, moved to the right in many ways, even from the Bush period, even though obviously Bush was in a lot of ways more of a disastrous president. But so at the same time as that has happened, obviously, like those of us in this meeting here are part of this, new and growing left that's also a product of this period. And so, what do you think are, to some degree, like, what is this history like? What kind of lessons does today's left take from it? Like, how do we avoid the kind of anti-populist turn that is seemingly sort of the drift of the American left for like a long time?
I get you. That's a great question. And I want to first of all say that because I often sound like a very negative person, and I am a very negative person most of the time, but I want to say that that groups like yours make me so happy. I mean, when I was starting at, when we were doing the Baffler magazine, and I mean, up until very recently, people always regarded me as a crank, and my views were so outrageous. And there was, no one was listening. And it is absolutely wonderful to see so many, I mean, and a lot of this is the Bernie phenomenon, Bernie is responsible for this, that so many people now see through the Democratic Party bullshit and understand that there has to be this fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. And that, just another round of Obamaism or Clintonism is not going to help, is not going to do a whole lot. It's going to maybe get Trump out of there, but it's not going to do a whole lot. And that is wonderful that there are now so many people that agree with me on that. And I'm very, very grateful for that. Here's what you have to keep in mind. The way that it's the last chapter of my new book of The People Know. Okay, it's called The Utopia of Scolding. And what I mean by that is, so I live these days in Bethesda, Maryland, which is this very affluent white collar suburb of Washington, D.C. And it's one of these places that has gone from Republican to Democratic over the last 20, 30 years. And it's very, very wealthy. And, I don't think there are even any Republicans in our neighborhood at all. But the kind of liberalism that these people embrace is one that has nothing to do with the traditional politics of the left, has nothing to do with unions, has nothing to do with, blue collar, has nothing to do with these economic issues of the left at all. It's entirely about being more virtuous than other people, being a better person than other people, shaking your finger at those lower in the hierarchy than you. And that's what I mean by the utopia of scolding. These people already inhabit a magical land of economic plenty. Beautiful houses, wonderful cars, a big yard. The COVID is not a big problem for them. They work out of the house. They're doing great. The stock market's up. They're doing absolutely wonderful. And they've embraced left politics because in a lot of ways, it makes them feel really good about themselves. They are not only better than, they're not only richer than people lower on the social scale than them, they're better than people who are lower on the social scale than them. And they absolutely love to, shake their finger at the lower orders and accuse them of being, poorly educated and not, and being, wrong-headed in all of these different ways. And that's the kind of liberalism, I'm so sorry to say this, but that's the kind of liberalism that really prevails in this country. And it has a huge, and it's very, like I say, it's very attractive to a certain kind of person who loves to be better than others. Loves to think of themselves as better than others. The problem with it is that it's the absolute antithesis of movement building. This liberalism of scolding. And by the way, you see it on Twitter. Twitter is exactly this. Twitter is the liberalism of scolding, where it's like, I've got the correct line. It's sectarianism. It's old left sectarianism, just taken to this kind of, like space age extreme, where it's like, me and my Twitter account are going to correct the whole goddamn world. we're gonna we're gonna set everyone straight. We're gonna defeat everybody, you know. And why is this a problem? This is let me take a step back here. There's a great historian of populism, a guy called Larry Goodwin. He wrote the classic book on populism that came out in the 1970s called Democratic Promise. And if you haven't read it, you should. He also wrote an abridged version of it that's much easier to swallow called The Populist Moment. And before he wrote those books, he worked in the civil rights movement in Texas in the 1960s, you know, registering people to vote and organizing people. And so he knew about social movements like ours. He knew about them firsthand. And after he did that, and he wrote about the civil rights movement a lot, and he did oral history, worked on oral histories of it and that sort of thing. And then after he wrote about populism, he wrote a bunch of articles about democracy itself and asking, how do you build a movement like populism? Because among other things, populism wasn't just a party. It was a mass movement of farmers and working people. It was one of the biggest mass movements in American history. How do you do that? How do you build something like the CIO in the 1930s? You know, this labor movement that grew by a factor of 3 in a very short amount of time, that was just signing people up, that changed the face of this country and built the middle class. How do you build a movement like that? How do you build a movement like the civil rights movement, like something like SNCC, you know, that went throughout the South organizing people and registering people to vote? There it is. Somebody's got a copy of The Populist Moment. So he wrote these articles. How do you do that? How do you build a movement like this? And one of the answers, and I quote him in my book here. I'll hold it up. So how do you build a movement like this? And the answer is one of the answers is practice ideological patience. This is a term that Goodwin made up. Ideological patience. Okay. You can't just go around saying, I am so pure and fine. You know, I have the answers. I have the correct line. We're going to fight with the Trotskyists across the street till we whittle it down to who has the correct line. Is it my group of 3 guys with the mimeograph machine, or is it their group of 2 guys with the different mimeograph machine? That's not how you build a movement. The way you build a movement is by accepting people or going to people as they are in the world. The idea of the movement is to bring them up, to build them up, to bring them in and to teach them to change people. And you can't do that by demanding they be pure in the beginning. And this is what he meant by ideological patience. And here's the thing. We don't do that today. We have no interest in that today. All we wanted, I'm not you and me, the Democrats, the sort of the sort of culturally hegemonic left. This culturally hegemonic left is all about scolding and purging and canceling and kicking people out and deplatforming people. And this is, folks, this is the wrong way to go. What's funny is it's so attractive to so many people. People love this, you know. It's very, very attractive to a certain kind of person. But this is not how you build a movement. This is a recipe for disaster, is what this is. And yeah, I know Biden just won the presidency, and that's great. And Democrats control both houses of Congress, and that's great. And I'm really happy, and I'm really looking forward to what they're going to do. But this is not how you build a social movement. Okay, I talk too much.
I think that's a good note to open it up to everybody here. So the way we just do Q&A in these things is you write stack in the chat. I'm going to demonstrate it, or Kit has just demonstrated it already. Maybe we'll take like 2 at a time, I think, and then and yeah, give you a chance to answer. So I see Kit and then Jorge on stack.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Kit, and nice to meet you. I love the insight that you've brought to this, especially this week. My question is that I'm going to provide a little bit of context. I've heard you give interviews now twice on 2 separate podcasts, Citations Needed and Bad Faith. And you're wonderful, quite charming. But the question that I have, and the thing that started to have me a little concerned about right here and now with the growing left movement, is say both of those podcasts make a couple $100,000 a year each off of Patreon money, and good for them. I'm happy that they have a life and can afford like rent and whatever doing that. But there's a certain extent, like I think Bad Faith makes like $400,000 a year. And I find myself thinking like, shouldn't at a certain point we be spending that money? If people are giving $5 a month of their hard-earned money, shouldn't we be putting that to the DSA or to something that's more about action and political action and organizing, as opposed to just more discourse, commentary, spectatorship? And I guess you might have a better perspective on this because I'm young and I've only been part of this recently. Is there a certain point at which left media, or this kind of new careerist leftist podcasting media stuff that I think we're all probably pretty aware of in the DSA, is that only ever beneficial, or is that at a certain point a snake eating its tail because it is still more focused on just learning and talking and listening and having opinions, as opposed to organizing, acting, finding out what you believe by joining movements and doing things? And everyone here at the DSA doesn't have that problem because we all decided to do that and are not just listening to podcasts. But in your experience, maybe with a little bit more history, lived experience, am I being young and naive and this is just like one step toward a positive, unprecedented change in the last 100 years of left media that's influencing the rise of actual movements? Or is there a certain point at which it's kind of unproductive and we need these people to just be like, hey, stop just tuning in, start doing something together?
Look, I totally know what you mean. And I imagine, I guess I'm part of the problem here because that's what I do, right? I used to be a card carrying pundit. I had a column at the Wall Street Journal, for God's sakes. I didn't make no $400,000 a year. That's kind of impressive. But look, movements need both. You have to have people that are out there spreading the word and doing the debate and fighting the fight. And there is something extremely useful about that. I just think about how quickly people on the left mobilized, in the last couple of weeks over various different issues and really made their voices heard very quickly, which would never have happened. When I was younger, that would never happen at all. You took Bill Clinton and that was your choice, and you you had to accept. There was no, that's all you got. and he's going to name some shitty people to his cabinet and you've got no say. There's nothing you can do about it, and that's gone. And those days are over, and that's a good thing now. But I totally know what you mean. Like, this is a movement with like all colonels and no corporals, and that's a huge problem because organizing is the real work, as we all know. That's how things really change, is through mass movements, not through a bunch of highly educated people fighting with one another. So you got to have both. Maybe there's a happy medium. Maybe DSA can start its own podcast and make a whole lot of money that way and pay organizers. Look, people have to, people have to eat. They have to have a livelihood, and so that in that sense, I certainly don't begrudge them their success. I want people to succeed, and I want them to have a nice living and all that. But the organizing is also super duper important.
So next is Jorge, and then I have Christian and Carrington, and I'm just going down the stack. If you want to jump on stack, just write in the chat. So Jorge.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you so much for coming here tonight, Thomas. And been really enjoying your new book so far, since I'm in the middle of it. So kind of what Kit just did, I want to give a bit of context before I get to the question. Basically, I think what you talked about tonight regarding populism, how it's historically meant as opposed to like what people typically talk about in the media, is a very important distinction. I think the definition description you've given of populism is great, and in many ways a lofty ideal for people who are on the left and organizers to strive towards. However, the question I want to posit is more about the limitations of populism, and how about we go about dealing with that as people on the left. Because now I'm not here to suggest that populism is a bad thing. I think it's the way you've defined it, being like a movement of providing democracy and creating democratic processes for the people, is an exceptional thing, in my opinion. What I am saying is that it's possible that populism may not go far enough in the struggle for liberation and emancipation for everybody, because it can be limited by the biases of what people in the majority of a populace believe in a certain moment in time. Like I'm thinking about, like, say, like the civil rights movement in the 60s being incredibly unpopular, and how the federal government had to literally force desegregation in many states, which was in our governmental system an anti-democratic move given the beliefs of people at the time. Now, if we look at now our times, like BLM was unpopular 5 years ago. And so, and now it's become popular because of like mass action. But given the description that you've kind of given of populism, how does it account for this kind of like things that are popular in a certain moment in time that are anti-democratic, well, say, liberation for certain groups, but it's in particular to kind of to certain groups, but are in the aggregate ways in which our oppressive society intersects with these particular oppressions, making it to this larger situation. Like, or like, am I just misunderstanding how you define populism, or is it just like a limitation of it?
Okay, so there might be a little misunderstanding there, but it's a good question anyways. And my definition of populism, and I'm not going to hold anybody to it, everybody uses the word in different ways nowadays, but my definition is a transracial movement of working class people for economic democracy. So you can have transracial movements that aren't about economic democracy, and that's not populism. Or you can have movements for economic democracy that don't involve working class people, and that's not it either. But here's the deal. So we've seen this, like I say, three important times in our history, in the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 60s. And except for in the 30s, populism was not popular. So these guys in the 1890s, they would proclaim their great faith in ordinary people. They called them the plain people, their great faith in farmers and working people and all that. But that doesn't mean that they were going to win. In fact, they wound up losing. So, they started out, they thought they didn't win, and they got crushed. So it's not just whatever is popular. It's this very specific thing, this faith in working class people and in their ability to understand their own situation and that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily popular. Now, other people use the word in different ways, but I think my definition is the right one. And look, the views that you and I share are not popular. I mean, let's face it. And we're going to take shit for our views all our lives. I mean, I'm 55, and it's all I do is get shit for my views. It's tiresome. But so I'm sorry, I forgot where I was going with this. You got me at the end of a long day, and I'm exhausted.
Were you going to say something just about the 60s in there?
Well, hell, I mean, Martin Luther King, this is a guy that Jorge, I don't know how far you've got in the book, but have you got to the part about Martin Luther King? Okay, so he knew all about populism, and weirdly, we all use the word to mean like the wrong thing. We use it to mean these terrible things. He actually knew what it really meant. He had studied his history, and he got it precisely right. It's fascinating, and wanted to build a kind of populist movement of his own, and died when he was murdered. That's what he was in the process of doing. But it wasn't, he said, look, what we're trying to do is extremely hard. We've won these great victories against, as he put it, the coarse sheriffs. This guy had a great way with words, the coarse sheriffs, and these sort of easy to hate people like George Wallace, and stuff like that. But the much harder task is going up against capitalism itself and trying to reform capitalism itself. And that's tough, and that's hard. And there you're not going to have these nice, suburban liberals on your side. Anyhow, so I guess that's where I'd go with that.
Next on the list was Christian, then Carrington.
Hey, Thomas. Nice to meet you. I've been a huge fan. I was saying in the chat that I'm dating myself, but I read What's the Matter with Kansas when it came out. So hopefully I haven't made myself seem too much like an old Gen Xer. But so I think I've been in DSA like 3 years now, and I think that, you know, for many of us, something that we struggle with is holding each other accountable and sort of having tough conversations with each other that doesn't fall into that kind of utopia of tisking or scolding or whatever it was you called it. Because I feel like, you know, we're all swimming in neoliberalism. So it's really hard to not revert ourselves to the cultural norms. And so I'm just wondering if in your research or if you have ideas about, you know, how we can sort of you know, talk to each other and hold each other accountable in a way that isn't this moralizing nonsense, you know, but really does kind of help each other to kind of grow and get better and more comradely.
I mean, that's a really, really good question. And I've had the same problem in my own life, you know, and go back to What's the Matter with Kansas. This is a book that I wrote after spending a couple of years hanging around with really conservative people. And I would, if they asked me about myself, most of them were pretty open. You know, they wanted to tell me about their views, which were ridiculous, right? I'm sorry, that's a mean thing to say. They wanted to tell me about their views, and they'd sometimes ask what you know, I didn't conceal it from them. I'm like, you know, I'm really liberal and I live in Chicago. And you know, and they would still weirdly enough tell me everything. You know, confide in me all of their, you know, their career as an organizer for the right. And by the way, one of the reasons to go back and look at that book is because these people were immensely successful in organizing for the right wing in the state of Kansas. I mean, they conquered the state, and you know, it's kind of a shocking story. Anyhow, but that's getting away from. Look, I'm a journalist. I did that book. I wrote that book by, and this sounds weird because people look at the title and they look at like the first couple of pages of it, which are written in this kind of comical voice, and they think I have nothing but contempt for those people, and that's not right. I actually liked a lot of them. These are people that in a different situation would be our friends. I'm absolutely certain of it. And you know, as I go through life, I meet people like that all the time. And I try very hard, just in an individual way, to not be judgmental towards them. But it's difficult because they believe things that are so fucking screwy, you know? And it's hard to, you know, forgive a lot of this stuff. You know, people that blockade abortion clinics, that's really bad. Now, I have not met any of the people that just stormed the Capitol building, but I met a lot of people that waved those stupid like snake flags and, you know, a lot of that other bullshit, you know. I know a lot of people who own guns. It's tough to walk that line, right? How are you going to do both things at the same time? To recognize that this stuff is killing our country, and it's killing any chance of us ever getting out, escaping from neoliberalism. But at the same time, you have to be a good person. You know, you have to practice what Larry Goodwin called, remember what ideological patience. So it's a question that I don't think I can answer. Because I have to do it both ways. I'll get an example. I can't stand Donald Trump. But a lot of the people that voted for Donald Trump, no, I'm not going to say, oh, I'm not going to speak to you because you voted for Donald Trump, or I'm going to kick you out of my family because you voted for Donald Trump, or I won't have Thanksgiving dinner with you because you voted for Donald Trump. That's just asinine. I'm sorry, that's also a mean thing to say, because maybe some of you in this call do that, you know. But you see all these kind of liberals who are constantly urging people to treat conservatives personally with contempt, and that is just not the right way to go. So it's it's not a fine line, I guess. In the end, you despise a guy like Trump. You denounce a guy like Trump. He's tricked these people. He's a con man. He's a crook. He's a fraud. He's a Pied Piper. He's, I was watching that video that Don Jr. shot of Trump, and he's just finished giving a speech to the crowd that is set off to ransack the Capitol building. And they're in a fucking hospitality tent somewhere, and they're playing rock music, and they're all billionaires together. They're all very rich heirs, and they're partying, and they're having another wonderful day because they're very, very wealthy people, and they're just enjoying life. And it just turned my stomach, Trump and the way he what he says and what he does. But that doesn't mean that I automatically despise everyone that voted for him. I mean, a lot of them are motivated by, really awful stuff, but a lot of them in other circumstances would be with us. And you just have to remember that. At least I hope they would. Well, you think about all the guys that that voted for Bernie in the primary in 2016 and then went out and voted for this asshole,
Carrington.
Yes, my thanks as well for you joining us tonight. It's been a great evening. So my question is that, while Marxism has a definite conception of class conflict, populism is organized around the people versus elites, but it's not hard for these elites to become identified as urban sophisticates rather than owners. The resentment of poorly defined elites can easily take a right-wing turn, intellectuals, Jews, etc. Can you speak to this at all, a lack of analysis, and without it, the risks of misplaced blame, and maybe how you might share an analysis with the people? Like you say, like socialism can't reach the people, but can an analysis reach the people?
Oh, absolutely.
I wonder if you can speak to any of these points or all of them.
Absolutely, yes. Look, as we all know, look at what Bernie showed. This analysis absolutely can punch through, and people can hear it, and they know it's true. And look, I was more surprised than anyone when What's the Matter with Kansas was a bestseller, because it was the same thing. My analysis, come on, you've read it. It's straight up, it's socialist, and people read it all over America and knew that it was true. And there are examples of this, but you are absolutely right that, and so the original populists, by the way, had a very clear idea of class conflict. And they if you go back and look at their famous manifesto, it was called the Omaha Platform. It was written in 1892. And they basically say there are two classes in the world, and it is rapidly coming to a war. We are approaching, combat between these two groups, and the populists were absolutely adamant about only talking about economics, only talking about economic issues. This class conflict was an economic conflict. It was secondarily a political conflict, and so they tried to reform the political system. Like the war on lobbying, making it easier to vote. Votes for women, that sort of thing. So reforming the system was important, but it was mainly about economic issues. They tried really hard to avoid the culture war issues, and they, with less success. I mean, there was some anti-Semitism in the populist movement, but not as much as there was in the sort of culture as a whole. If you go back to read popular magazines from the 1890s, they're just like massively anti-Semitic in a way that just turns your stomach. But you're exactly right that that class hostility of however you want to put it, is very easily hijacked by the culture wars, or by racist sentiment, or by anti-Semitic sentiment. That is true. And the Republicans are very, very good at this is what Fox News is all about. This is the entire career of someone like Glenn Beck. That's what he does. Hijacks class anger for the right. They specialize in this. Steve Bannon does this. I'm going to give you one funny Steve Bannon anecdote, and then I'll stop. But you're basically, Carrington, you're exactly right, and you have to constantly remember that this is fundamentally about economics. That the struggle of classes is fundamentally about economic issues, not about taste. Although that's important, but anyhow. But okay, funny Steve Bannon story. Have any of you guys seen his documentary about the financial crisis? It will absolutely make you chuckle. It's he made it in about 2010. It's called Generation Zero, and it starts out. It seems that he used to produce movies right before he became Donald Trump's campaign manager, and it starts out. It seems like a normal documentary about the financial crisis. He interviews all the same experts that are in all the other financial crisis documentaries, and they're talking about the big banks, and they're talking about what went wrong, etc. And then the whole thing swerves, and he tries to blame the financial crisis on the hippies of the 1960s. And there's no reason for it. It's like Trump saying, I won the election. There's absolutely no argument. There's no theoretical linkage. It's just like, well, the people in the 60s thought it was okay to lie, and here in the aughts, people are lying. Therefore, this caused that. It's absolutely crazy. And he spends the whole hour and a half, pursuing this hobby horse. And I watched this, and I'm like, why would someone do this? Why would you make a documentary like this? And it's obviously because he's trying to make it into a culture war. And the Tea Party movement, by the way, was very good at doing this, taking people's anger and redirecting it at the wrong villains. They specialize in doing this. And this shit had real consequences. This is what pressured Obama and made him back off the idea of doing a bailout for homeowners. Was that stupid rant. What was that guy's name? Do you remember? Rick Santelli and the Tea Party movement. Yeah. Okay, next.
Next is Farzana. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. And then David.
Awesome. You pronounced my name correctly. Don't worry, Jeremy. So thanks, Thomas, for being here. And thanks, Jeremy, for moderating and taking stack, especially when there's a lot of people in the Zoom room. But Thomas, I've been helping a comrade lately who's running an organizing 101 class.
Say that again. A what? An organizing what?
An organizing one-on-one class, or 101 class. So basically,
okay.
Introduction to socialist organizing. And I've been helping her sort of compile resources on religious literacy and how religious communities can be partners in socialist projects. And this is particularly significant because, so much of the working class, white working class, Black working class, immigrant working class are religious, and their religious communities provide socioeconomic services for them as well. So I'm reminded during this process of the sort of latte libel that you discuss in What's the Matter with Kansas? And I'd really like to ask you about the sort of the lack of religious literacy on the left, as well as the sort of, prioritization of cultural issues that many religious communities find quite contentious. So based on the research that you did for What's the Matter with Kansas, as well as, other reflections or reflecting that you've done, how do you think the left can improve its ability to partner with and just generally appeal to religious working class people in the U.S.?
Isn't that funny? I was raised in a very, very religious household, and so that's these questions. Look, we are part of the turn toward the professional class, which in the Democratic Party over the last 40 years or so has been has involved this sort of turning our backs on these things. We understand ourselves as friends of science. I mean, you see this everywhere here in COVID time. Friends of science, friends of rational inquiry, all that. We're all highly educated, and we understand the Darwinian theory. I mean, that's how I started What's the Matter with Kansas. The project was when the state of Kansas, they were having a culture war over the theory of evolution. And I couldn't believe it. It was very upsetting to me. and I wanted to know how this happened. And it was exactly what Carrington was asking about before. They had the sort of right wing in Kansas had figured out how to use to generate a fight over the theory of evolution in order to sort of start a culture war. Let's turn parents against these scientists who are writing the school curriculum. And one of the reasons they did it is because they knew. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's having an argument in the background. But part of the reason that they did this, and this is actually really interesting, is that they knew in any kind of public conflict, and they would set it up this way deliberately. They'd get like a mom of some kids going to a public school somewhere in Kansas, and the mom would make this request that sounds really reasonable on the surface. She'd say, well, I don't want my kids learning that, because we're trying to raise them as in a Christian household or something like that. And to a lot of people that sounds really normal. And then they knew, because they also knew how the scientist would react when you put the scientist in the witness chair or at the lectern. The scientist is going to pull rank on you. Always. They're going to be like, well, look, I have a PhD and I say that blah 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 blah, and you need to shut up. And this was like 20 years ago now that they had figured this out, and we've just continued down that path, and there's a reason they pick these culture wars. And that was on the surface, it looked so stupid. The theory of it, that you're really going to fight the theory of evolution in the year, whatever it was, 2001, that just seemed crazy to me. But once I dug into it, I totally got it, that this was a way of picking a fight with the picking a cultural class war with the educated elite. And once you started, this was the great insight of what's the matter with Kansas. Once you started drilling into it, every culture war battle was about this, was in some way an attack on the highly educated elite, always with the view to getting them to come out and say something contemptuous about ordinary uneducated people or people who hadn't gone to college or whatever it is, always. And oh my God, our team falls for this every single time. Every single time. We are the paleontologist from the University of Kansas who comes out there and says, well, I have a PhD and you need to sit down and shut up. Every time we do that, and every time we lose. Every time we do that, we lose. But that's exactly what it is. Okay, so how do you respect people's religion? Well, I lost my religion some time ago, so I don't I'm not but look, all of the movements that I describe in the book, the populists in the 1890s, the New Dealers in the 30s, Martin Luther King, these were all movements that had a strong religious presence in them. The populists weren't, they were all over the map religiously speaking. You had the village atheist, in there, you had the evangelical Christian in there, but they had a very evangelical style. And for a lot of these people, it's very obvious that, a lot of the teachings in the Bible are totally compatible with socialism. This is obvious to a lot of people. Anyhow, so I just want to say to you, Farzana, this is ultimately someday this is the sale that we're going to have to make, and I think we can do it.
Next is David, and we're going to have to close Stack soon, so I'm sorry if we can't get to everybody, but David and Annie are on Stack. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much for being here. Listen Liberal is absolutely the reason why I'm here, why I'm a member of the DSA. I read it when I was working at a neoliberal think tank, and I was kind of...
Which one?
The Vera Institute of Justice. A criminal justice nonprofit. They do very good work, but I was pushing on economic things, and I was pushing against I didn't know it was the neoliberalism I was pushing against. And I was like, why is it that people kind of glaze over when class comes up? And when I read the book, I really felt like
Yeah.
the guy in the Matrix, where it was like, oh my God, like I get it now. So I really thank you. And I'm not a sophisticated socialist thinker or anything, so please forgive the question if it doesn't make sense. But it's a little bit of a follow-up on the last person's question. You know, Trump, I think, you know, there is no ideology to Trumpism. I mean, now he has his big lie, right? So he has the big lie, the election is a fraud. So that's kind of an ideological pledge, but it really, to me, is so much about like the power of this social group that he's captured, the white suburban homeowners association. I think a lot of it in a way is about affect too, a certain affect of cruelty in a way. It's like the way that Fox News is like Monday Night Football, you know, like the way they look, you know, the graphics and the kind of like that aggressivity. And he has clearly built this group of people. The millions voted for him, and these people they ran up and risked their lives for him. You know, they were pushing against, they killed a police officer. I mean, what they did at the Capitol was incredible. And I think so much of it's not class-based. It's based on, how much of that is based on sort of social group kind of contact. And were the populists you talked about, did they use social group contacts like religion or fraternal orders or informal social groupings to kind of coalesce people? Because it's not just ideology that will make someone join. People aren't out there like, what's an ideology how can I undermine capitalism? They hear about it from Marge at the bake sale. And so I guess the final piece to my question is, are there forms of sociality that we are not taking advantage of that we absolutely should, you know, like for instance, religion?
That's a really good question. That's a great question. Yes, the populists did have what you call a form of sociality. It was a mass movement of farmers. It was called the Farmers Alliance. It was one of the great mass movements in American history. And if any of you are familiar with the Farmers Union, which still exists today, that's a very similar organization. But farmers at the time were more than half the population. This was an enormous group. And they were in big trouble economically, and they started signing up for this organization, the Farmers Alliance, in huge numbers. These are very poor people. And the Farmers Alliance seemed to promise them a way out of their problems through collective action. They would come together, they would learn about their situation, and they were really into education, the idea of learning about economics and learning about politics and why we're so screwed, not learning about ideology, but learning about the nuts and bolts of why their position was so bad. You know, the ideology comes after that. And this movement caught on in a huge way. It swept the country. And they would have their huge meetings out on the prairies, and they had literature, and they had newspapers, most importantly, in every small town in Kansas. I don't know about other states, but every small town in Kansas would have a Republican newspaper and a populist newspaper, and they would go at it with each other. And they distributed pamphlets by the millions, and they would send lecturers around the country, usually, well-known people or highly educated people who would explain economic issues or political issues to these farmers. And this movement, so they call this Larry Goodwin, the guy I was referring to earlier, calls this the movement culture of populism. And so by joining this in this mass movement, learning about their situation, coming to understand that other people are in the same position, that builds, that's where the politics come from. The politics are second. Building that movement is first. And you see that again in the 30s with the labor movement. And there are a lot of other similar movements in the 30s, like Huey Long had a movement. I forget what it was called, the Share Our Wealth movements, or Share Our Wealth Society or something like that. And you see it again in the 60s. And so movements are extremely important. And usually what I'm describing are movements where their concern is about something else, not politics. Their concern is about something else. Like, we're farmers, and we're really screwed. What can we do about it? Or we're industrial workers. I work in this factory, and we're starving. We're unemployed, and we don't know what to do with ourselves. We don't know how to get out of this situation. And a group comes along and says, if we get together, we can exert power. And then the politics comes out of that. And so that is absolutely important. And this is something, by the way, that we on the left have lost sight of. We think that
I saw AOC was gaming on a very popular game. I don't know the name. I'm not into gaming, but when I saw her on it, I was like, she was like on there on some very popular game, and she has a Twitch channel, and I was like, what is she doing on there? And I thought, wait, this is a great way. People love that stuff.
Wouldn't that be funny if that worked?
Because there's millions of people on those games, and so those non-traditional ways of broadcasting ideas, where they're like, she's just this crazy politician and she's playing this game with me, but she's getting these ideas in there too, and maybe it's that these non-traditional forms.
I think your microphone turned off, David. All right, so that sounds great to me, but what I'm referring to is something more practical. And let me put it this way. If you go to a lot of communities in America, I always go back to Kansas because I spend a lot of time there, But if you go to a place like Wichita, Kansas, or to a smaller town in Kansas, there's a right-wing presence, because there's a right-wing presence everywhere. It's on your radio. It's on your radio all the time. It's on your TV set all the time. But there is no comparable. There's nothing like the Farmers Alliance today. There's nothing like the CIO, the labor movement, that you can sign up for, and that's sweeping the nation and is promising a better life. And that absence is something that's very that makes building a left very, very difficult. Okay, enough on that one.
Yeah,
I think we have time for a couple more.
One more? Yeah, great. Annie, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi. So my question, I think, connects to a bunch of people's questions about presenting externally a popular left analysis and doing so without judging, moralizing, or scolding. And so I have to admit that much as I love the left and I love socialism, like the reason why I read your books is because I think you're an incredible storyteller, and you write with great humor and warmth. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to tell the stories of the left and unpacking left-wing history and kind of repackaging it for normies, basically, for a popular audience, which is, I think, a skill that is vital to bringing, say, like the DSA project into the mainstream.
Yes, that is my lifelong. That is what I've been done with. That's what I've done with my career, Annie. That is exactly what I tried to do, and I really want to recommend this new book, because this is, and I'm not just doing the all colonels, no corporals thing. It really is good in exactly the way you describe. Well, fuck it. I can't say my own book is good. Jeremy, help me out here. It is exactly what Annie just described. It's telling the story of the left. That's what I tried to do. That is what I've always tried to do. And I wish I could do do it better. By the way, we have lost this because the left has become so identified with intellectual pursuits and with intellectual rightness. We like scholarly journals, and like a bunch of literature professors fighting with each other at the MLA or something like that. That's what we are, right? We think we can get to the bottom of it. We'll have a panel discussion, and we'll get the answer at the end of that. But no, you've got to engage with the mass public. I mean, this country, and maybe this should be the last thing I say, we often think that we're so alienated, and look at this country. They voted for this asshole Trump. This country is a left-wing country. I mean, I've gone all over the world, and I am absolutely convinced that this is that the people of this country have the strongest sense of sort of democratic sensibility of any people I know of. This sense of this egalitarian sensibility that is just absolutely profound, and you don't see it in any other group of humans that I know of. And that's why I think, all these assholes that say America is a center-right nation, I just hate that. No, America is like, I want to say America is Thomas Jefferson's nation, but Jefferson is in bad odor these days. But America is a profoundly democratic nation. And in that sense, America is a left nation. And it's a tradition that is on pause these days, that we have lost touch of, but that you can clearly see is coming back. Look at what Bernie did. Look at how hard the Democrats had to work to stop him. Look, and Bernie, by the way, I think if Bernie was in this conversation, he would agree with everything that we're saying. Bernie knows that this stuff is true. You have to build a movement. You can't be judgmental towards people. You have to speak to people in a way they can understand. You can't be a dick about it. Bernie knows this stuff, and he sees how people have been deceived by the Trumps and the Bannons of this world. And that is the future, I don't know who the next Bernie is going to be. I assume it's not going to be Bernie himself. And somebody else is going to come up, but it is going to get harder and harder and harder for the Democratic Party to stop us. And maybe that's where we should end.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. So I'll say thank you so much for coming out tonight, Tom. And I'll just make a couple really brief announcements before we go our many ways, because got to make the organizing asks always. So for everybody on this call, this is part of the North Brooklyn Night School. Our next session is in 2 weeks. We meet every 2 weeks on Monday nights. Our next session is on tax the rich, how to do it, why we don't do more of it, and how they get away with it.
Read up on Huey Long there. Yeah, that was his entire idea, was a gigantic wealth tax. It was very popular. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll stop interrupting you.
No, keep doing it. Second of all, our North Brooklyn has a branch meeting tomorrow night where we're going to talk about building the labor movement is going to be one of the two main topics. What DSA does in New York City to build the labor movement. We'll also be talking just about the events of the last week, both Georgia and the riot in the Capitol. And so please join us for that tomorrow night. Link in the chat. We have a Socialist City Council member running very close to us, Michael Hollingsworth. For anyone who's heard him speak or listened to him, he's amazing. He's the real deal, a tenant who has been struggling to fight his landlords and organize for a long time, who's running for city council. Tonight's a filing deadline, so please reach into your pockets and give him some of that socialist cash to take out the capitalist trash. And finally, on Friday, there's going to be a socialist State of the State address where the newly elected socialists in Albany, DSA members, are going to be responding to Andrew Cuomo's State of the State address, which was today, but I think is also for the rest of the week. I don't know what exactly is going on there, but are going to, I think, try to give kind of a better sense of what we can do to fight for a better New York for working class New Yorkers. So that's on Friday, link in the chat. Don't miss it, and invite your friends. Again, I think it's a chance to popularize our message, so please spread the word very widely. I think that's about it. Thank you so much again, Tom. Thanks to everybody who came out tonight and the great questions, and solidarity.
All right. See you guys later.